The evening air in Berkeley, California carried the familiar sounds of college life on February 4, 1974. Students hurried across campus with books tucked under their arms, the scent of eucalyptus trees mixing with the aroma of coffee from nearby cafes. In apartment number 4 at 2603 Benvenue Street, 19-year-old Patricia Campbell Hearst sat with her fiancé Stephen Weed, sharing what should have been an ordinary Sunday evening together. The granddaughter of legendary newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst, Patty lived a life of privilege that most could only dream of, yet she seemed content in her modest student apartment, far from the gilded halls of her family's empire. The knock at the door came at exactly 9 o'clock, sharp and insistent. Stephen rose from the couch, perhaps expecting a neighbor or a friend dropping by. What happened next would shatter not only their quiet evening but would become one of the most perplexing and controversial crimes in American history. The door burst open with violent force, and 3 figures stormed in, their faces hidden, guns drawn and gleaming under the apartment's soft lighting. The smell of gunpowder and fear filled the small space as chaos erupted. Patricia Hearst's scream pierced the night as rough hands grabbed her, pulling her from the safety of her home. Stephen Weed, her 26-year-old fiancé and graduate student, lunged forward instinctively to protect the woman he loved, only to be savagely beaten with the butt of a rifle. Blood streamed down his face as he crumpled to the floor, helpless to stop what was unfolding before his eyes. A neighbor who heard the commotion and tried to help was also beaten and tied up alongside Stephen, both men forced to watch as the attackers dragged Patty, blindfolded and screaming, toward their waiting car. The kidnappers threw her into the trunk of their vehicle like a piece of cargo, her muffled cries barely audible through the metal as they drove into the California night. In those terrifying moments, as the car carried her away from everything she had ever known, Patty Hearst could never have imagined that this violent abduction would transform her from victim to participant in a story so bizarre that 50 years later, people still debate whether she was a captive or a willing accomplice. The group responsible for this brazen kidnapping called themselves the Symbionese Liberation Army, though they were neither an army nor particularly well organized. Led by a charismatic and dangerous escaped convict named Donald DeFries, who had taken the name Cinque Tomb, the SLA was a small but deadly collection of middle-class white radicals and a handful of others who believed they could spark a revolution through violence and terror. DeFries himself was a complex and troubled figure, a man whose life had been marked by crime, imprisonment, and a burning desire to lead something greater than himself. Born in Cleveland, Ohio, DeFries had spent much of his adult life in and out of prison for robbery, assault, and other violent crimes. In prison, he had been exposed to radical political ideas and had developed a talent for manipulation and leadership that would prove both magnetic and deadly. His escape from Soledad prison on March 5, 1973, had been surprisingly easy, leading some to later question whether authorities had deliberately allowed him to flee. Whatever the truth of his escape, DeFries made his way to the Bay Area, where he was hidden by white radical sympathizers who saw in him the revolutionary leader they had been seeking. The SLA's headquarters was a cramped, dingy apartment in the Sunset District of San Francisco, where the smell of unwashed bodies, cigarette smoke, and fear permeated every corner. It was here that they brought their terrified captive, shoving her into a closet so small she could barely sit upright. For 57 days, this closet became Patty's entire world. The space was barely 2 feet wide, with no light except what filtered through the crack under the door. She was blindfolded constantly, fed sporadically, and subjected to a relentless barrage of political indoctrination mixed with threats of death. The psychological assault began immediately. Her captors told her repeatedly that her family didn't care about her, that they would never pay for her release, that she was nothing more than a symbol of capitalist oppression. They played recordings of revolutionary rhetoric at deafening volumes, forcing her to listen to hours of anti-establishment propaganda while she sat cramped in the darkness. The sounds of their voices became the only human contact she had, a twisted form of companionship born from complete isolation and terror. Meanwhile, the outside world was consumed with the story of the missing heiress. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in its history, with hundreds of agents working around the clock to find any trace of Patty or her captors. The Hearst family, led by Patty's father Randolph Hearst, publisher of the San Francisco Examiner, found themselves thrust into a nightmare of public scrutiny and private anguish. Every day brought new agony as they waited for word about their daughter's fate. The SLA's demands were as bizarre as they were impossible to fulfill. They initially wanted the release of two of their members who had been arrested for the assassination of Marcus Foster, Oakland's beloved black school superintendent, a murder that had shocked the community and turned public opinion against the group. When that demand was refused, they shifted to something even more outrageous. They wanted Randolph Hearst to distribute food to the poor throughout California, a demand that would cost millions of dollars and serve as a public humiliation of the powerful Hearst family. Desperate to save his daughter, Randolph Hearst agreed to the food distribution, spending over $2 million of his own money to feed the hungry across the state. The images of long lines of people receiving free groceries filled television screens across America, a surreal spectacle that seemed to turn the kidnapping into some twisted form of social theater. Yet even this massive gesture was not enough for the SLA, who declared the food to be of poor quality and demanded even more. But something far more sinister was happening in that dark closet where Patty remained imprisoned. The constant indoctrination, the isolation, the threats, and the gradual erosion of her sense of self were taking their toll. Her captors began to show her small kindnesses mixed with their cruelty, a classic technique of psychological manipulation. They would bring her food and speak to her kindly one moment, then threaten to kill her the next. This cycle of abuse and false compassion began to break down her psychological defenses in ways that would have lasting consequences. On April 3, 1974, nearly 2 months after her kidnapping, the world received a shocking message that would change everything. A tape recording arrived at a Berkeley radio station, and when it was played, listeners across America heard Patricia Hearst's voice making an announcement that seemed impossible to believe. She declared that she had joined the Symbionese Liberation Army of her own free will, that she had taken the name Tanya after a Latin American revolutionary, and that she was now a willing participant in their fight against the system that had created her privileged life. The voice on the tape was recognizably Patty's, but the words seemed to come from someone else entirely. She spoke with a newfound conviction about the evils of capitalism and the necessity of revolutionary violence. She declared her love for her captors and her hatred for her family, calling them agents of oppression who cared more about their wealth than about her welfare. Most shocking of all, she announced that she would remain with the SLA to fight against everything her family represented. 12 days later, on April 15, 1974, security cameras at the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco captured images that would become some of the most famous crime scene photographs in American history. The grainy black and white footage showed a group of armed robbers entering the bank, and there, clearly visible among them, was Patricia Hearst. She was dressed in a dark coat and beret, carrying a semi-automatic carbine, and appeared to be an active participant in the robbery rather than a hostage being forced to cooperate. The bank robbery unfolded with military precision that suggested careful planning and preparation. The robbers moved quickly and efficiently, ordering customers and employees to the floor while they emptied the cash drawers. Patty's role in the robbery was unmistakable. She was not cowering in a corner or showing signs of being coerced. Instead, she moved with purpose, keeping watch over the hostages while her companions gathered the money. Her transformation from kidnapped heiress to armed revolutionary seemed complete and willing. The aftermath of the bank robbery sent shockwaves through American society. How could a young woman from one of the country's most prominent families have joined her own kidnappers in committing armed robbery? The debate that erupted would continue for decades, dividing experts, legal scholars, and the general public. Some believed that Patty had been subjected to sophisticated brainwashing techniques that had genuinely converted her to the SLA's cause. Others argued that she had willingly joined the group, perhaps out of a desire for excitement or rebellion against her privileged upbringing. The psychological concept of Stockholm Syndrome, though not yet widely known by that name, began to enter public discourse as experts tried to explain Patty's apparent transformation. The idea that hostages could develop emotional bonds with their captors and even begin to identify with their cause was still relatively new in 1974, and many people found it difficult to accept that such a thing was possible. Yet the evidence seemed undeniable. The young woman on the bank surveillance footage bore little resemblance to the frightened victim who had been dragged from her apartment 2 months earlier. As the FBI investigation intensified, the SLA found themselves under increasing pressure. Their hideouts were discovered one by one, forcing them to move constantly and live in conditions of extreme paranoia and stress. The group began to fracture under the pressure, with members questioning DeFree's leadership and doubting their ability to achieve their revolutionary goals. The romantic ideal of being underground revolutionaries gave way to the harsh reality of life as wanted criminals, constantly looking over their shoulders and trusting no one. The beginning of the end came on May 17, 1974, when the Los Angeles Police Department surrounded a small house in the Compton neighborhood where 6 SLA members, including Donald DeFreeze, had taken refuge. What followed was a gun battle of unprecedented intensity and duration, with over 9,000 rounds of ammunition fired in what would become the largest domestic shootout in American law enforcement history. The house was eventually consumed by flames, and when the smoke cleared, all 6 SLA members inside were dead, their bodies charred beyond recognition. But Patty Hearst was not among the dead. She had been at a different location when the shootout occurred, and she watched the news coverage of her companions' deaths with a mixture of horror and grief that suggested her emotional bonds to the group were genuine. The images of the burning house and the bodies being carried out on stretchers seemed to break something inside her, stripping away any remaining illusions about the revolutionary life she had chosen. For more than a year after the Los Angeles shootout, Patty remained a fugitive, living underground with the few surviving SLA members. They moved from safe house to safe house, often staying in squalid conditions and surviving on the charity of radical sympathizers. The glamour and excitement of revolutionary life had long since faded, replaced by a grinding existence of fear, poverty, and constant vigilance. Yet Patty remained with the group, participating in additional crimes including another bank robbery in Sacramento where a customer was killed. The end finally came on September 18, 1975, when FBI agents surrounded an apartment building in San Francisco and arrested Patricia Hearst along with 2 other SLA members. The young woman they took into custody bore little resemblance to either the privileged college student who had been kidnapped or the confident revolutionary who had robbed banks. She appeared thin, exhausted, and emotionally shattered, her face showing the toll of nearly 2 years of life underground. The legal proceedings that followed would become one of the most closely watched trials of the decade. Patty's defense team, led by the famous attorney F. Lee Bailey, argued that she had been the victim of coercion and brainwashing, that her participation in the SLA's crimes had been involuntary and the result of sophisticated psychological manipulation. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about the effects of prolonged isolation, indoctrination, and abuse on the human psyche, painting a picture of a young woman who had been systematically broken down and rebuilt in the image her captors desired. The prosecution, however, presented a very different narrative. They argued that Patricia Hearst had willingly joined the SLA, that she had had numerous opportunities to escape or seek help during her time with the group, and that her participation in their crimes had been voluntary. They pointed to her apparent enthusiasm during the bank robberies, her statements on tape recordings praising the SLA's cause, and her continued association with the group long after she could have reasonably been considered a captive. The trial became a battleground between competing theories of human psychology and criminal responsibility. Expert witnesses debated the reality and effects of brainwashing, the nature of coercion, and the extent to which extreme psychological pressure could excuse criminal behavior. The case raised fundamental questions about free will, moral responsibility, and the limits of human endurance under extreme circumstances. On March 20, 1976, after deliberating for just 12 hours, the jury returned a verdict that shocked many observers: guilty of armed bank robbery. Patricia Hearst was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, a decision that seemed to reject the defense's arguments about brainwashing and coercion. The verdict suggested that the jury believed she had chosen to participate in the SLA's crimes, regardless of the circumstances that had led to that choice. The imprisonment of Patricia Hearst became almost as controversial as her crimes had been. Supporters argued that she was being punished for being a victim, that her sentence was a miscarriage of justice that failed to account for the extraordinary psychological trauma she had endured. They organized petition drives and protest campaigns, arguing that she had suffered enough and deserved compassion rather than further punishment. Critics, however, maintained that she had received appropriate consequences for her actions, that privilege and wealth should not excuse criminal behavior, regardless of the circumstances. After serving nearly 2 years in prison, Patricia Hearst's sentence was commuted by President Jimmy Carter in 1979, acknowledging the unique and troubling circumstances of her case. She was released to rebuild her life, to try to find some sense of normalcy after years of trauma, captivity, and legal proceedings. In 2001, President Bill Clinton granted her a full presidential pardon, officially clearing her record and acknowledging that justice had not been fully served by her conviction. The story of Patricia Hearst raises questions that remain relevant today about the nature of victimhood, the effects of psychological trauma, and the extent to which extreme circumstances can excuse or explain criminal behavior. Her case occurred during a turbulent period in American history, when the country was grappling with social upheaval, political violence, and questions about authority and resistance. The SLA, despite their grandiose name and revolutionary rhetoric, were ultimately a small group of confused and dangerous individuals who caused tremendous harm while achieving none of their stated goals. The psychological dimensions of Patty's case continue to fascinate researchers and the general public alike. The concept of Stockholm Syndrome, while controversial and not universally accepted by psychologists, provides one framework for understanding how someone might develop emotional bonds with their captors. The extreme isolation, the constant threats, the gradual erosion of her previous identity, and the replacement of that identity with one acceptable to her captors all suggest a process of psychological manipulation that went far beyond simple coercion. Yet questions remain. How much of Patty's transformation was genuine psychological conversion? And how much was strategic survival behavior? Did she truly believe in the SLA's cause, or was she simply doing whatever was necessary to stay alive? Was her participation in the bank robberies the result of sincere conviction, calculated performance, or something more complex that combined elements of both? These questions may never be fully answered, as they require understanding the internal psychological state of someone who experienced trauma and manipulation that few people could comprehend. The case also highlights the complex relationship between privilege and victimhood. Patricia Hearst's wealthy background both made her a target for the SLA and influenced how the public perceived her story. Some saw her as a spoiled rich girl who got what she deserved, while others viewed her as a victim who deserved sympathy regardless of her family's wealth. Her privileged background made it difficult for some people to see her as a genuine victim, while simultaneously making her story more compelling to media outlets and the general public. The role of the media in the Patricia Hearst case cannot be understated. From the moment she was kidnapped, her story was front-page news across the country. The dramatic elements of the case, the wealthy heiress, the revolutionary group, the bank robberies, the shootouts, seemed tailor-made for television and newspaper coverage. This intense media attention may have influenced the SLA's behavior, giving them the publicity they craved while also increasing the pressure on law enforcement to capture them. The broader social and political context of the 1970s also shaped how the case was understood and interpreted. This was an era of social upheaval, with the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and various radical groups challenging established authority. The SLA, despite their small size and ultimate failure, represented fears that many Americans had about domestic terrorism and political violence. Patricia Hearst became a symbol not just of individual victimization, but of the broader social tensions and anxieties of her time. The investigation into the case revealed troubling questions about the background of Donald DeFreeze and the origins of the SLA. Some researchers have suggested that DeFreeze may have had connections to government informants or intelligence operations, raising the possibility that the group was infiltrated or even manipulated by law enforcement agencies from its inception. While these theories remain controversial and unproven, they add another layer of complexity to an already Byzantine story. The impact of the Patricia Hearst case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. It influenced legal thinking about coercion and criminal responsibility, contributed to public understanding of psychological manipulation and trauma, and became a reference point for discussions about terrorism, privilege, and justice. Law enforcement agencies studied the case to better understand hostage situations and the psychological dynamics between captors and victims. For Patricia Hearst herself, the case marked a dramatic turning point that would define the rest of her life. After her release from prison, she married her bodyguard, Bernard Shaw, and attempted to build a quiet life away from the public eye. She became an author, writing about her experiences in several books that provided her perspective on the events that had made her famous. She also became an actress, appearing in several films directed by John Waters, who became a close friend and collaborator. Despite her efforts to move on, Patricia Hearst could never completely escape the shadow of her past. The question of whether she was victim or willing participant continued to follow her, influencing how people perceived her and how she was portrayed in popular culture. Documentaries, books, and movies about her case continued to appear decades after the events, each offering new interpretations and perspectives on the story. The case also had lasting effects on her family, particularly her father Randolph Hearst, who had spent millions of dollars trying to secure her release and then watched helplessly as she was convicted and imprisoned. The stress and publicity of the case took a toll on the entire Hearst family, forcing them to confront questions about wealth, privilege, and responsibility that they had never expected to face. Today, nearly 50 years after Patricia Hearst was dragged from her Berkeley apartment, her case remains one of the most fascinating and controversial criminal cases in American history. It serves as a reminder of the complex psychological dynamics that can emerge in extreme situations, the difficulty of determining truth in cases involving severe trauma and manipulation, and the ways in which individual crimes can become symbols of larger social and political tensions. The questions raised by Patricia Hearst's transformation from kidnapped heiress to bank robber continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about terrorism, radicalization, and criminal justice. Her case provides insights into how ordinary people can be drawn into extraordinary circumstances, how psychological pressure can alter behavior and identity, and how society struggles to understand and respond to crimes that don't fit easily into conventional categories of victim and perpetrator. The legacy of the Patricia Hearst case extends beyond true crime into broader questions about human nature, social justice, and the complex relationship between individual agency and environmental circumstances. It reminds us that the line between victim and perpetrator can sometimes be blurred, that extreme situations can produce behaviors that seem incomprehensible to those who have never experienced such trauma, and that our legal and social systems must grapple with the complicated realities of human psychology under extreme duress. In the end, Patricia Hearst's story is both uniquely specific to her time and place and universally relevant to anyone seeking to understand the depths of human experience under extreme circumstances. It is a story of privilege and vulnerability, of manipulation and resistance, of trauma and survival. Most of all, it is a reminder that truth in criminal cases can be far more complex and ambiguous than we might wish, and that justice sometimes requires us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of responsibility, choice, and redemption in situations that test the very limits of human endurance.